is so insane.
All right, welcome everybody. We have a new situation arising, a new guest, a new potentially a friend. We'll have to see whether he makes the friend cut or not. I'm just kidding. It's video from Chris Plance, and I think Chris might be friends with Tim Gordon. I don't know if you guys kind of know each other a little bit, but thank you for coming on tonight. I appreciate your willingness to hop on and have this discussion. This quick. That was very cool of you. We're going to have an open, free-form discussion, but maybe before we get started, do you want to tell us anything about yourself, what kind of content you do, how long you've been Catholic, what moved you to kind of do the YouTube apologetic sphere?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on, especially at late in the evening. I know it's tough sometimes to kind of work this all out, but thank you so much for having me on. And so a little bit about myself. I started my YouTube channel, I think like January is when I started it. And my interest really lies, I started the channel to explore what it might look like if we linked up the story of the Bible, the mission of the church, and the politics of the world. And there's a story as to how I kind of got interested in all of those different categories. But I grew up Catholic and then sort of fell away from my faith. You know, the joke is you go to Catholic school, you lose your Catholic faith, that whole thing. Went to go play baseball at a private college up north in California here. I grew up in LA and went to Westmont College in Santa Barbara and just fell in love with Jesus. My friends, I was kind of an atheist at the time, like pushing back a little bit. But eventually, gave my life to Christ. And then through apologetic means, having discussions with my Protestant friends, I eventually worked back my way into the Catholic Church again. So over the years, I have just fallen in love with Scripture. I mean, that's really my love, which is the story of the Bible. If I could spend most of the hours of my day doing one thing, it would just be studying Scripture. I love it. So that's sort of where my YouTube channel kind of comes in. I just kind of want to explore what it looks like when the story of the Bible sort of interacts with the politics of the world. And this is actually why I think YouTube, I had known about you for a while because you debated, early on, I was on the Rules for Retrogrades with Tim and Dave Gordon, and then backed out of there for a variety of reasons. And Tim kind of went with the channel. And obviously you've had a debate with Dave before, who's a good friend. And then Tim is still a really good friend of mine as well. So every now and then I'll peek my head over the fence and sort of see what's Jay saying. But because my interests lie in sort of the politics of the world and also the church and her mission and what she has said with regard to politics, I think YouTube, just their algorithm is crazy accurate. I mean, that video that you did popped up and I was like, why is it sending me this one dogmatic contradiction video? So I was like, okay, I'll check it out. And then of course I know why, because you're talking about what I talk about a lot of times, which is the fact that, look, the church has this teaching about the moral duty of the nations to recognize the creator God, specifically the creator God as revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. So this is something that I've been trying to turn up the volume on, a speaker that, as you rightly pointed out, has been turned down. And oftentimes you're right. It's almost like the whole thing is off. It's like this thing was the loudest speaker in the room for 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden it's like, where is it going? And I think that it's actually a service for Catholics to have you do what you did, which is to say, wait a second, you have all of these documents, Immortale Dei, Quas Primus. I mean, everything you were bringing up, I'm like, oh man, if only Catholics knew about this. But of course, part of my disagreement, early on, I was did a show or two with Taylor Marshall because Tim and Taylor were really close, and Taylor has the same concerns that you have, but about the documents of Vatican II and especially the contradiction, what seems like a contradiction in Dignitatis Humanae. I think you're being more consistent, perhaps, not to say anything about those guys, but I do think that, if there is a contradiction, you got to end up where Jay ends up. So you're not surprised, obviously, but I don't see it that way. And I wasn't really into the whole trad stuff and the trad debates that was going on. I wasn't coming from that world. I actually arrived at this whole Jesus Christ has all earthly authority because of the way I had been reading scripture. Um, there's this whole thing called empire studies in New Testament scholarship. I know I'm sure you know of it. And they're sort of pointing out not just like the Jesus is Lord stuff, where it's like, the person in the first century who used to say, I am Lord is Caesar. Caesar is Lord. And so if Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. And I actually think it's a bit more complicated than that, because it doesn't mean that Caesar is not in charge. It just means he needs to get baptized, right? So I started reading all these different passages, like the whole idea of, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God. And the whole point of the image on the coin is that Caesar is made in the image of God. And this is why all the passages in the New Testament say Jesus is the eternal image of God. And then it follows up with, this is why he must rule. This is why he must reign, all that stuff. So I kind of came at it from, it's interesting because I studied under a guy named Tremper Longman. I don't know if you wrote this this book in the 1992 that kicked off the biblical theology movement. And it was all about God.
I've read one of his books, so I know you're talking about.
Yeah, God is a Warrior is a book that I was familiar with because I had studied under him and I looked into some of his stuff. And the God is a Warrior is like a huge thing. And nobody would touch God as a divine warrior because at the time Muslims were, well, I mean, they've always been blowing stuff up, but at the time it was like, don't talk about this. And all of a sudden 9/11 hit, and then everyone's now interested in this divine warfare motif in the Old Testament. And Tremper had been writing about this for a while. He wasn't too scared of it. God is the divine warrior. Israel calls God the divine warrior in the New Testament. In the Old Testament when they crossed through the Red Sea. The Song of Moses and all that. But what that led me to is exploring the divine warrior motif in the New Testament, picking up where Tremper Longman left off, and just discovering, oh my goodness, because like the Chosen series. I tell my students this: the Chosen series has in like one of their first episodes. They're like, they have this little kid asking Jesus like a question. Well, Rabbi so-and-so says that the Messiah is going to be a warlike figure. He's going to be this warrior, right? And they have Jesus saying, tell me, is there any passage in the Old Testament that says the Messiah will be like this warrior or God will come back? And I'm thinking to myself, I was like, dude, like every passage in the Old Testament is about God is this, that the Messiah will be this kind of divine, like this military political leader. But of course, when you get to the New Testament, it is interesting that Jesus is doing it quite different. Not what we would expect, not what you see with Simon Bar Kokhba and the other revolutionaries that are launching this messianic revolution. Jesus is doing something different. And I think the church fathers were right that basically like what he's doing is a kind of Christus Victor thing, right? He's destroying the powers behind the powers. And so I started to track this, in the New Testament. And then it kind of hit me like, wait, I think this is why Jesus says when he comes back from the dead, all authority on earth has been given to me. Because whatever happened on the cross, what we do know is immediately when he comes back from the dead, he says, all authority on earth is given to me. So it seems that if Satan is the ruler of this world, right? The New Testament says that over 21 times. He's the king of this world, prince of this world. All earthly kingdoms are sort of in his hand. Then when Jesus comes back and he says, all earthly authority has been given to me, something must have transpired. That really the Christus Victor motif, God as this warrior, the arrival of the divine warrior, actually culminates in this sort of political revolution, if I can call it that. Where all earthly authority has been given to him. Now, as a Catholic, where I slightly seeing that authority being placed in his chief steward, which is Peter, right? And I think, my expertise is definitely not in the church fathers. I try to read through as much as I can. And I know that you're well versed in all of this stuff. So I know that. And I know definitely, the church fathers really, 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 really well. But what I see kind of coming out of that Christus Victor, and then also coming out of, as you mentioned, the Gregorian reforms and the Pope sort of having more of this power, it's sort of wrestling with what I see in the New Testament is this, what does it mean for the Pope to have this binding and loosing authority along with the bishops that share in that with him? What implications are there? And then reading through all of these encyclicals, these rich encyclicals that you pointed out, I'm like, man, this is illuminating not just like a side issue of the gospel, but it seems like actually these things are touching on the gospel itself. What does it mean for Jesus to have all authority, and how does that actually work? I actually do think, and I haven't brought this up a lot on my channel, I will get to it, but I do think there needs to be a bit more of a development in terms of still what that implies and what that means. I don't think I think the laity need to be brought in. I like the ecclesiology of Vatican II, where it's more of an emphasis on the role of the laity, as well as part of the church. Because in the Middle Age, it was more like clergy and laity rather than church and state. But anyway, so that's kind of how I ended up sort of in these issues. I know for a lot of trad Catholics, which I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't be called a trad Catholic, although I don't even know what that means anymore. But I sort of arrived at it like, oh, this is the biblical story, and Jesus having all earthly authority is just another expression of him being the creator God, him being what the entire Abrahamic promises were meant to, the scepter that was promised to Judah, the nations, the union of the nations in Genesis 12, that was a reversal of Genesis 11. It's all about Jesus having all the Davidic kingdom.
Yeah. If you don't mind, let me maybe say something.
Sorry,
So I would say pretty much everything that you've said up to a point, I would totally agree with. And I think that it's pretty clear when you really get into biblical theology that the New Testament does not have this position of, separating the idea of the temporal power from the spiritual power. If you look into the early church as the theology, quote, develops, and I don't mean develop in the sense of undergoing evolution or change, I just mean as the church more and more states with clarity what the church's position is, particularly in the first, say, 8 centuries, you do absolutely see statements consistently made by many, many church fathers and even in the ecumenical councils on the role of the state in regard to the church. And what's interesting is a lot of what you said we would agree with, and we would say you do find in the 7 ecumenical councils. And I'm only picking the first 7 just as a time frame to kind of look at as an example. You begin to see, for example, St. Ambrose says that the emperor has a duty to God. The emperor should have Christian principles undergirding the theology of the empire. We start to see Christian laws themselves with Theodosius. And then by the time of St. Justinian, you have an explicitly Christian emperor, which, although not accepted as a saint in the West, or excuse me, the Latin Church or the Roman Church, he is seen as a saint in the Orthodox Church because his theology is what's essentially promulgated at the 5th Ecumenical Council. So we see a very crucial role for the state to do what we think is sort of the manifestation of the Byzantine double-headed eagle. We see that double-headed eagle as one body of the people manifested with church and state. And of course, because there's 2 heads and they're kind of equal, we wouldn't say as Orthodox that the spiritual power is equal to or under the temporal power. Certainly the ideal situation is that they govern their realms or their domains. And so certainly the spiritual is kind of the ultimate authority. In the Orthodox tradition of, for example, coronation, the state ruler is anointed. It's almost a semi kind of sacramental ritual for the king to receive anointing by the church. However, this is where I think we would find the first point of departure, which is that in your model, you would see that as something embodied particularly in Peter and his successors as in some way kind of being a focal point perhaps of the temporal authority as well. And this is precisely what I'd like to first discuss with you, maybe put a challenge forward is, I would argue that in the first 7 centuries, the model that we see really clarified, especially by the 7th Ecumenical Council, is not one where the Bishop of Rome in any way has any temporal authority or power whatsoever, but rather there is pretty clearly the Byzantine Symphonia model that's outlined, for example, in the statements of the council between the Pope and the Emperor, the way that the 7th Ecumenical Council calls the emperor the God-ordained emperor. And so he has his sphere, which is the temporal sphere. But Chalcedon, very clearly, in Canon 7, and I understand that in your view, in your system, you would not think that the papacy is necessarily bound by the canons. You would say he's above the canons. But my argument would be that there's nothing in Chalcedon that in the canonical language in any way limits this stricture to everybody but the Pope. In fact, the way the canon is worded, and I'll mention Canon 7 because it says very clearly that those who have been enrolled in the clergy or have been made monks may not accept military or any secular dignity, and anyone who presumes to do so shall be anathematized. Now, I understand that in the Roman, in the sphere of Rome, with the collapse of the West, with the barbarians, and with the moving of the imperial capital to Byzantium, Constantinople, that there was this vacuum, and that the papal states arise out of that vacuum. I'm aware of all that, but my point is that pretty clearly the mindset of the church, and there's later canons that really back up what Chalcedon says. There's no place for the spiritual power coming in and saying that we are also the supreme temporal power. And precisely by the time that you get to Dictatus Papae, and then a couple centuries later, Unam Sanctam dogmatizes not just the idea that the temporal power is under God and under Christ, which we affirm, but that the Bishop of Rome uniquely is above and has all temporal power, and to be saved, you must accept that dogma, as Unam Sanctam says. That's specifically where I would pose a challenge and a point of departure.
Yeah, it's just I think when you look at like the writing, when I see Saint Ambrose, right, engaging with the emperor, clearly clearly the emperor's temporal power is, I mean, I think the challenge is the overlapping between the spiritual and the temporal, because the temporal power is not entirely competent. They think, for example, with California just redefined marriage, right? It doesn't even know when life begins. Right now, the temporal powers they're just not competent, like at so many levels. And now I'm not talking about it, it's interesting, and this is where I think the church needs to press a bit more, is that it's not, if grace does build on nature, and I don't know if this is the Eastern language, you'd agree with this, it builds on, like Aquinas says, like it purifies nature, it heals nature, perfects it, and then elevates it. And it's like, well, if the Pope has the authority that, say, Vatican I says that it has, and that's a proper exegesis of Matthew 16 and other passages, then the Pope has an authority that's not just for elevating in terms of telling us about the Trinity, stuff that reason could not discover. But, and this is something the East is really good at, but it actually gives us stuff that we could know by reason, but we couldn't figure it out because we're corrupt. Our minds are corrupt. So the church has the church has this moral authority as well. So it's like the state, in subject to the dark power, sort of loses this kind of, it's not competent to make proper moral decisions, but it kind of needs to be. And the church is competent in making infallible moral decisions. And therefore, the church, the state needs to sort of, and when you look at the church herself is going to identify the Pope as that center of unity, the person who has this specific charism, right, along with the bishops in union with him, has this specific charism to teach infallibly on faith and morals. And so I see the temporal authority that the Pope has as being not just a spiritual authority, but also temporal in the sense of the state is not always competent, even in matters of morality. And so I see, and I also see the two like going together. They're not necessarily equal. Like I like the image that Leo the 13th uses of the soul and the body, which I know you're super familiar with. And that the spiritual is meant to help heal and govern and direct properly the passions themselves, right? The temporal body of the state should be moved by, illuminated by the spiritual, the soul itself, which is that spiritual authority that the Pope has. I see the temporal authority also, I should say this, as being an authority that the Pope has over the laity. And I think it gets tricky when you're in secular governments that don't recognize Christ, that don't recognize that he has this authority. And so it's like, what does the church do? Does the Pope technically has, as the church says, all authority on earth, as Jesus has all authority on earth, temporal and spiritual. But what do you do when you have secular states that don't believe that he has temporal authority in the sense that he can, that he can define such things as what marriage is? Not just that he can give us a proper definition of the Trinity, or a proper infallible definition of whether females should be free, stuff like that. So I think the nature and grace stuff is convoluted. I think the church and state is sort of convoluted because the nature and grace debate. Sorry, I'm hearing my echoes.
Oh, my bad. I have to ride the mute button. I didn't mean to. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Well, but here's the thing. Like, for the sake of our discussion here, I'm not granting that the Bishop of Rome has any temporal authority at all. Now, maybe you can demonstrate that, but that's kind of what I'm going for here, is that the Byzantine model is that there are two spheres. And we do have a distinction in Orthodox theology between nature and grace. I would not say that it's the same kind of model that Thomists have. It's very different. But aside from the issue of Thomism, I mean, again, I think we're not disagreeing about the principle of whether the state has a duty to God, and ultimately we would hope in a predominantly Christian sphere, it would be Christian. A Christian state is the ideal. In the Orthodox view, when the majority of the people are Orthodox, at that point it's appropriate to have an Orthodox government and Orthodox laws. That's always been what's called the Symphonia model in the East. But I'm asking a different question to you, which is, first of all, where do you get the idea that the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop is even a thing, is the first question. And I would ask for any patristic era citation that there is such a thing in the first 7 centuries, given the fact that Chalcedon specifically forbade all clerics from having any civil governmental roles at the pain of excommunication, and there's no exemption for the Roman bishop under this canon. So I'm curious, where do you think that this, I understand you're going to say, well, it derives from the nature of the Petrine office itself and the supremacy of Peter and so forth, but I'm saying, where in the church fathers at all in the first 7 centuries is anything akin to what Unam Sanctam and Dictatus Papae claim?
Okay, so what I would want to do is actually run this back and go through the entire story of Scripture, but I'm not going to obviously do that now.
Well, but where we're disagreeing is the historic teaching of the church's interpretation of the passages, because I understand you're going to see a lot of passages that you think vindicate this idea of temporal supremacy, and I'm directly giving you patristic evidence at Chalcedon, which rejects the notion of any clerics having any temporal supremacy or right to engage in those professions. And again, remember that the question is not, does the church have a say-so in the government, or should the government be Christian? The contention is that Dictatus Papae and Unam Sanctam explicitly say that the Pope is the Emperor of Emperors and King of Kings, and above all emperors has the only right to use the imperial insignia, and that all emperors must kiss his feet. Where is that in any patristic writing at all in the first 7 centuries, except for the feigned forgeries like the donation of Constantine, which backed up this doctrine?
Okay, so what I would want to do is, as a Catholic, and you would affirm with this, that Jesus Christ has all earthly authority, and you would say also that Jesus has all temporal authority. Are we equating that, or I
agree that the divine person of Christ is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and he absolutely has all spiritual and temporal authority. Absolutely.
So how would you parse out the idea that Jesus has all earthly authority? How does he exercise that earthly authority here on earth, that temporal authority?
Well, when he ascended in our nature, he now in our nature possesses the keys, not just of death and Hades, but also, as you pointed out, I think in your opening salvo there, you mentioned all authority and all kingdoms, powers, and dominions have been handed to him. When he ascends, and I think the passage in Daniel and the passage in the Apocalypse are not about the end of the world; they're actually about the ascension, and that means that when he ascended, because he's now in our nature, what perhaps in a spiritual sense might have been formerly the right or the temporary possession of Satan is now given to the God-man in our nature, and so his body, the church, actually possesses all reality. All of the universe will be our inheritance. But in the concourse of church history, the way that I believe Christ has outlined for that governance to occur is not for the church to have temporal supremacy, but for the church and the state to be under God. That's the difference. In the papal model, there is a single-headed eagle that is embodied in the person of the Pope with temporal and spiritual supremacy. In the Byzantine double-headed model, which is the entire history of Byzantium, it's church and state in their relative spheres, and that's why it was such a revolution for Dictatus Papae and for Unam Sanctam to now posit that salvation requires submission to the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop.
So what authority then does the Eastern Patriarch have over the emperor or over local governments? Say, does he have any authority, and the bishops have any authority over?
So the ideal situation of Symphonia is that the bishops and the church have authority in the spiritual realm, and so they could conceivably, in an ideal setting, remove or reject or excommunicate, say, a heterodox emperor. And there are situations where that happened. We did have heterodox emperors at times that were considered to be, for example, there were iconoclast emperors, and much of the church rejected them, although much of the church unfortunately fell to those heresies. But for example, the ecumenical councils, they're all called by emperors. And so clearly, and I'm not saying that's necessarily ideal, because eventually when we have, heterodox emperors, this becomes a difficulty. It becomes a challenge. Now, the church didn't, even in the East, didn't totally succumb to heterodox emperors, or else we would all be iconoclasts and so forth. But the point I'm making is that the mere fact that all the ecumenical councils are literally called by the emperors, and even the Fifth Council is essentially Justinian telling Pope Vigilius what to do. He says, you will submit to the decision of the council. And Pope Vigilius doesn't say, I'm above you, I have the spiritual authority, you're out of here. He submits. Now, whether you think that's wrong or right, it at least shows that at that time, operant in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, where, by the way, they teach pentarchy. The Fifth Ecumenical Council says there is a pentarchy. The Pope didn't have a problem at that time with pentarchy. The Pope submits to the decision of the council and of St. Justinian. Now, again, whether that's wrong or right, it shows that the mindset of the church at that time, at least, is not the mindset of Dictatus Papae and Unam Sanctam, that the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop is just obviously self-evident, de facto, and necessary for salvation.
So if the Patriarch of Constantinople is living within a Christian state, and say the Patriarch of Constantinople or an Eastern bishop says to that state, are you in communion with Eastern Orthodoxy? You're not in communion with the Russian Patriarch, right?
No, I attend the Rocourt Church, and I am in communion with the MP.
Okay, all right. So let's say, I forgot his name, Patriarch.
Kirill?
I forgot. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Kirill is the Russian MP, and Bartholomew is the EP.
Yeah, I knew Bartholomew. So let's say, does the Patriarch of Russia have any authority over right now the President Putin at all? Like, if he excommunicates, he has the authority to excommunicate Putin, right? Or would you say no?
I mean, again, ideally, the church does have that spiritual authority, absolutely. Now, are there situations in church history where you could have bishops installed by and manipulated by the state? Absolutely. This is a thing that's happened many, many times in church history in the East and in the West. For example, German kings for an entire century installed who was Pope. So if this is not something unique to the East, it's very common in the East and the West.
Sorry, I might have asked that wrong, but I'm asking that if the Patriarch of Russia has an authority to determine matters of faith and morals for Russia and the president of Russia, and let's say they're living in a Christendom kind of thing, right, where it's a Christian community. See, I would see if the Patriarch says, hey, marriage is between a man and a woman, so you need to reverse this decision that's on the books. I want you, President Putin, to do that. And does he have that authority, which I would see as kind of as a temporal authority? This is why I think we might be talking past each other with what do we mean by temporal authority.
Right. So again, I would say that yes, the church, and by the way, the church is not just sort of like patriarchs are not little popes. They have canonical privileges within their jurisdictions, and they may have large jurisdictions and a lot of influence, but they're still part of a synod. And so, one big difference between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church is that the Orthodox Church is far more decentralized than it is centralized. So even patriarchs are very limited by decisions of and the participation and the college, you could say, of the rest of the bishops in their synod. And we would say that's really just the ancient model of the church. But so ideally, again, setting aside the possibility of the state, influencing bishops or KGB bishops during the Cold War and this kind of stuff, ideally the position is that, yes, the church has the authority to say any state ruler or king or president or whatever is excommunicated and is in error if he does something like that, right? They have that authority. And so if Kirill writes a letter or sends out an encyclical and says, we reaffirm the traditional teaching that marriage is between a man and a woman, and we reject, President whoever, let's say Putin decides he's pro-gay or something, we reject this decision and he must return to the Orthodox faith in the position of marriage between a man and a woman. That isn't anything to do with the church having suddenly temporal authority. They're still in their sphere, and because the church, the spiritual authority is superior to the temporal authority, it doesn't mean that the church now becomes a civil authority, you see, because there's still those spheres. And that's precisely the canonical limitations that Chalcedon is laying out. Chalcedon is saying that it makes no sense for clergy to be state rulers or to have jobs in the state, meaning clerics shouldn't be going to war. They don't have standing armies, which the papacy eventually has, by the way, in the Pope Alexander. So all of these violations revolve around the violations of the spheres. But having spheres doesn't mean that you can't speak to the state or tell the state it ought to be doing those things. In fact, that's what your duty is.
Okay, so I don't know where necessarily I disagree. I mean, I like what you're saying.
Let me restate the question, and I'm not trying to be rude, but I want an answer to where in the first 7 centuries of the Church Fathers is there anything like what you're saying of a bishop of Rome or any bishop taking on temporal authority and power?
I don't think you see the Bishop of Rome now, I'm not a church historian. I'm not as well versed as you are in this, but I don't think I see the Pope taking on a temporal authority in the way that you're describing. I think I'm having trouble understanding what.
But the way that I'm describing was the descriptions of Dictatus Papae and Unam Sanctam. That's the medieval Roman Catholic papal definitions of what temporal supremacy means on the part of the Roman bishop.
I think that it depends. If the Pope is going to claim temporal authority, just make a broad claim. Jesus Christ has all authority in heaven and on earth. The Pope's going to say he's the chief steward, but it's going to look different when you have those in society that are either a society made up of the Catholic laity, Christian laity, or a society that's not made up of the Christian laity. So the church wouldn't.
Okay, so
the Pope isn't going to, the first several centuries, the Pope is not going to make the kind of claim.
Again, Chalcedon is 451. We're at the period where there is even post Theodosius an explicitly somewhat Catholic. We would say Orthodox Catholic. And let me read Canon 7 of Chalcedon again. We have decreed that those who have been enrolled in the clergy or have become monastics shall neither accept military charge nor any secular dignity. If they presume to do so and they do not repent, they are anathematized. That's Canon 7 of Chalcedon. That's explicitly in a period where there is profuse Christianization of the Roman Empire, maybe not total, but very, very widespread. Clearly, canonical limitations on clergy being involved in state positions.
Okay, but I don't think that when the Pope Jesus Christ is exercising his earthly authority through the Bishop of Rome, through the bishops, through the Catholic laity. So the church is exercising a temporal authority, a temporal potestas or auctoritas, through the Catholic laity. And this is what I said in my video, that the Pope is not taking on a temporal secular office, a secular dignity, or a military role.
But he is.
He can.
No, he is. I'm not trying to be rude, but like Dictatus Papae explicitly says that he is. And Unam Sanctam. Yeah. So Unam Sanctam explicitly says that if you do not accept that temporal power and authority, you're not saved. So Dictatus Papae, which is under Gregory VII, 1090, this is registered in the papal registry at that time. There wasn't such a thing at that time, as far as we know, as anything like a official ex cathedra statement. There was just what was called the papal registry. And I'll read the dictates of Dictatus Papae in 1090. The Roman Church is founded by God alone. The Roman Pontiff alone is called universal. The Roman Pontiff alone can reinstate bishops. In a council, his legate, even of a lower grade, is above all bishops and can pass a sentence in deposition of any bishop. The Pope may depose those that are absent. That, among other things, we ought to remain in the same, not to remain in the same house with anyone excommunicated by the Pope. That it is alone lawful for, according to the needs of the time, the Pope to make new laws and assemble congregations, to make new abbeys, canonry, and other operations, including the enrich new bishoprics or unite the poor bishoprics. He alone may use and wear the imperial insignia. The Pope alone, of the Pope alone shall all princes kiss his feet. That his name alone shall be spoken in all the churches. This is the only name in the world. It is permitted to the Pope alone to depose emperors. It is permitted to the Pope alone to transfer bishops if needed. The Pope alone has the power to ordain a cleric of any church as he may wish. Now you understand that prior to this, it wasn't the papacy that ordained all bishops in the world, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So now keep it. There's more, because it goes on to say, no one may judge the first see. No one can be condemned to appeals to the apostolic chair. The Roman Pontiff alone can make all of these decisions without any consent of a subordinate. The Roman Pope alone can depose and reinstate bishops without any synod. It goes on and on and on. It's essentially more and more of the same. But the point is that you have very clearly the first time, and by the way, this is not just my opinion. If you read Dvornik, if you read Congar in 900 Years Together, or After 900 Years, if you read Sashensky, who eventually was a Catholic scholar that became Orthodox, they will all, if you read Papacy and the Orthodox, all of these texts, including the Papadakis Meyendorff History of the Church in the Middle Ages, all of these texts from Uniate and Orthodox scholars of this period will admit that Dictatus Papae was the normative mindset of the Roman Catholic Church in the 11th century in the Gregorian reforms. So this is particularly the shift period where the church is moving out of a collegial synodal model that you see even up into the Seventh Ecumenical Council, where they still talk about pentarchy. Now it's becoming a sole autocratic model, and it's not accidental that at this time period is when you have these outrageous claims of temporal power and supremacy, which I would argue really come to a full fruition a couple centuries later in Unam Sanctam, the 1302 bull of Pope Boniface VIII, which argues that all of those temporal claims, that the Pope has authority over all emperors, can depose at will, and this is precisely what leads Alexander and other Renaissance popes to have standing armies. It's because of Unam Sanctam. And they based these things on Samachian forgeries, donation of Constantine, things that were forgeries. So how at all can any of that be justified in the first 8 centuries of Christian theology and church history?
So I think you and I are disagreeing. What I think I'm disagreeing with you on is that to claim temporal authority does not equal or automatically mean that one is holding to a secular office or secular dignity. So what I see happening in these documents is exactly what you had read, which is that the Pope has authority over a legitimate society, which is the church. And when secular rulers, the laity, when those secular rulers are the laity, they have authority over them. And so they can depose emperors. And in that sense, they have temporal authority. but the Pope is not, by deposing an emperor, then becoming an emperor. So I see this is why I think Vatican II's ecclesiology is helpful here, because it puts it, when we say that the church has spiritual and temporal authority, yes, the Pope has it, but in terms of temporal earthly authority, that is exercised through the Catholic laity in union with the Pope.
Okay, so when we get to Alexander and the Renaissance, Borgia, etc., Medici era of the papacy, and the Pope has standing armies, you don't think that has anything to do with these documents?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I think it's a good challenge that you're bringing up, Jay. But I don't. I mean, because then I would have to say, I mean, what are the? I mean, the Pope has a secret service. The Pope still owns private property. The Pope is still the sovereign over the 2.5 square miles that he's in. I mean,
well, but that he does these things. How does that prove that it should be done? I agree he does and has all these things, but what does that have to do with whether it's right?
I'm sorry. Could you ask the question again?
That the Pope has these things, we don't disagree on. But my challenge is, should the Pope do and have these things? Is the challenge.
Yeah. So you're saying that when the council in its canon says that no religious cleric should hold a secular office, right, military, otherwise, that when the Pope is owning a piece of property and then making himself basically a secular sovereign over the 2.5 square miles.
No, over all emperors in the world.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just, in reality, the emperors in the world,
the problem is not the church owning property. Obviously, the Moscow Patriarchate owns many properties in monasteries and cathedrals, has a lot of money. The problem is not the owning of property. The problem is affairs of the state, and that sphere now being the job of the papacy, such that by the time of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance era, you actually have like geopolitical world power operatives, right? We've got spies, we've got assassins, we've got all that stuff going on in the Borgia period, even up to today. Now, I know you've had talks with your buddy Tim Flanders, and Tim has done interviews with David Wimhoff, whose 500-page book I've lectured through and talked about for many years, John Courtney Murray at the CIA, Time Life magazine, the relationship between the CIA and the Vatican, particularly at Vatican II. And part of the thesis of that book, I'm not saying this is true because Tim Flanders interviewed, I'm just saying that this is not outlandish. Part of the thesis of that book is that at the time of Vatican II, for example, there was such a tight relationship between the Council Fathers, at least many of them, and the CIA, that it's very difficult to divorce the decisions of the Second Ecumenical Council, the Second Vatican Council, and what the designs of the CIA were at that time. That, to me, that's another example of Caesaro-papism, or perhaps papal Caesarism, because the CIA is really telling, many of the popes at that time what to do. Now, I don't want to deflect off into Vatican II, but let me give you another type of example to demonstrate this. And there's a great chapter on this. I know you might not agree with it, but the Papadakis and Meyendorff have a great book called The Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy. And the reason this book is so good is that it's treating precisely this period of 1071 to 1453, which is where we really see the pivoting between East and West going in different directions. We would argue the East goes in the continuation of what the mindset of the church of the first millennium was with synodality. And we would argue that the Western Latin Church, the Latin Franco-Papal Church, goes in the direction of this sort of papal geopolitical power and monarchy. In the end of this chapter discussing the Gregorian reforms of the 11th and 12th century and on into even later popes who went even further than Gregory VII did, there was a rise of something very new called the fighting orders, the monastic fighting orders. And this is something very new. And what Papadakis and Meyendorff argue is that post Dictatus Papae, this allowed the papacy to essentially create, although not yet a full-on standing army, monastic warrior monks who would be really the monk knight armies of the papacy. And so originally, I'm not saying that they are now, I know we all know the history of the Templars, I think, but originally the Templars and their history and the Knights Hospitaller and so forth were actually to be agents, knights, and warrior monks of the papacy. Now, maybe you think that's cool or whatever. It's from a literary perspective, I guess it's kind of cool. But did you notice that at Chalcedon, all monastics are forbidden from any kind of warfare or anything like this? Now, whether you think it's right or wrong, does it not at least show a vast shift in the 11th century to have warrior fighting monks that are the agents of the Pope? Does that not show a big difference between the way the church in the first 1,000 years viewed monasticism? Are you there? You're muted, so I don't know if something got muted. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I apologize.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know the history as well as you, so I don't really feel like I should comment on it, but it does seem, interesting that the Pope says, hey, you religious, can you read the canon one more time and say what it is so I can have it in front of me? Specifically what it is.
Yeah, it's canon.
Not a disciplinary, right? This is a doctrinal.
Well, I mean, all of the canons of the councils are potentially doctrinal and or disciplinary. It really depends on which canon it is and what it's about. But this is specifically Canon 7 of the Council of Chalcedon, and I would add that it's not the only canon like this. It's just one of the earliest and clearest, which says, we have decreed that those who have been enrolled amongst the clergy or have become monastics, that they shall neither accept military charge nor any secular dignity. If they presume to do so and do not repent in such a wise to turn again to what they had first chosen for the love of God, they shall be anathematized. And so this is, we would say, and this, by the way, this canon and others are part of what forms the Byzantine model of the relationship of church and state. So maybe we were getting confused earlier about when you say the temporal power, maybe you thought that meant like anything relating to the temporal. What I meant was the state, the imperium. And so in the Byzantine model, the state ruler is seen to be a diakonos, a deacon of a sort, because Paul in Romans 13 says the Roman emperor is a diakonos, which is why in the Eastern tradition, he can actually go behind the altar. He has a seat back there with the clergy. The emperor does.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's intended to show, the Byzantine model is that the state ruler is an icon of God and should be an icon of the church and of Christ, as much as the people in the church and the members of the church and the clergy should be icons of God. That's the goal, the ideal. Doesn't mean it's going to always happen, but that's what we're shooting for. However, that doesn't mean that the church becomes the state or the state becomes the church. So there is, we would argue, again, two heads. The heads are not supposed to be melded into a big papal head. They're different spheres, and this is really the model that you see in the first 1,000 years, and that's why I keep pointing to that 11th century period where even the Orthodox and Uniate scholars admit there's a huge shift.
I mean, I like a lot of what you're saying. Even the point about the deacons. I mean, clergy still can't run for office today, right? They're not allowed to. Actually, deacons are allowed to, right? The mayor of Downey. The mayor of Downey was a deacon of the Catholic Church.
Well, this is actually a difference between Orthodox and Catholics. For the Orthodox, deacons are actually part of the priesthood. And I don't think in the Roman Catholic view, deacons have any role of priesthood. But for Orthodox, deacons are part of the priesthood.
Yeah. I don't think deacons would be part of the clergy in the Catholic understanding. But which is why, the Canon 7 would exclude the clergy, and it does say monks there too. So the very fact that they call forth, as you said, that you have these monk-like armies. Now, I do know that there's this what's this book called? It's really good. It's called, since you're bringing up books here, monasticism. It's about monasticism and the martial elements of monasticism. Sorry, one second if I could get it. I don't know where it's at. Whatever. But it's it talks about how, actually, let me see. I'll look up the book. Who is it by? What's her name? bear with me here for a second.
Yeah, that's fine. While you're doing that, somebody said, what about the lower orders and clergy? No, so readers in the Orthodox Church are not members of the priesthood. The first order of priesthood in the Orthodox Church is the diaconate. Hence why, for example, it's not in the Orthodox Church, it's not wrong to call a deacon Father Deacon, right? That's fairly common in certain jurisdictions. But a reader, no, a reader is not part of the priesthood. And in the Orthodox view, this has to do with who and what can do things can do things at the altar or behind the iconostasis, right? So readers, they don't go and touch the Eucharist and this kind of stuff because they're not part of the priesthood in the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, so Catherine Allen Bynum, and I don't say this to make any point towards my argument, but she has a really good book called War and the Making of Medieval Monastic Culture. And it's actually a book that's influenced me a lot, even in terms of my ecclesiology, because I think that when you look at the rise of early monasticism and war, because many of these monks, like St. Anthony, many of them were soldiers that after they retired from being soldiers, they became monks. And so you have basically what she does. It's the subtitle is, I can't see the subtitle. It's War and the Making of Monastic Culture. There is no subtitle. And, but she tracks it from the early centuries, early on, like right out of the gates, first, second century. And then she goes all the way through medieval monasticism. And she points out that a lot of these soldiers that are retiring from military active duty, they would go and join the monastery. And so what it ended up, because there were so many, what it ended up doing is creating within monastic culture, like even Saint Benedict, right? A former soldier who is one of the founders of early monasticism, and his shield, his emblem of, get behind me, Satan, what you offer me is evil, drink the poison yourself. That's his, in Latin, that's his, that's on his, what do you call it? Symbol, his crest. And the whole idea is that you have within monasticism, just this idea of it's a battle against the dark powers. And what she draws out is all of the analogies between that they used in taking all of their military experience and then transferring it into the monastic spiritual fight. So I'm not surprised that it could have been the case. Again, the history better than me, that if the Pope is going to call forth a military, if many of those guys that know how to fight are in the monastery, he might have to pull them out of
again, but that's the whole point of what I'm trying to say, is that the Pope is not supposed to call for standing armies, crusades, and all this stuff. And note that my objection has not. What?
But I think he can. He does have a certain authority where he could deem something as a holy war, call for Catholics to take up arms, and because they are the laity, he has a kind of authority. But that's the whole thing that's in question. So you keep saying that, well, he has this authority. I think he has this authority. I haven't granted that he ever has that authority. And again, the attitude of the church of the first 7-8 centuries is that no cleric has that authority. You don't see anything like that. There's absolutely nothing like that at all until the period that we've been discussing, about 11th, 12th, 13th century. That's the first time we see that. And it's not accidental that we see that in absolute concord with the time where the papacy begins to make these outrageous Dictatus Papae claims, because it is now becoming a worldly geopolitical institution. That has nothing to do with whether Jesus has authority in the temporal sphere, which we all agree, but we would argue that Jesus established limitations for what's appropriate for the state to do and what's appropriate for the church to do. So, for example, the church can't come in and tell the state, I want you to go attack all of my enemies. I'm the Pope, and if you don't, I'll excommunicate you, which is what the Borgia popes did. Likewise, the state can't come in and say, I mandate that you teach Arianism because I'm the emperor and you must do what I say. There's limitations to both of these spheres, and anytime one overlaps or takes over the other one, you get this
aberration, which is precisely what we would say the last 1,000 years of Rome is. And I don't know if you've read the Alexandria document from the Vatican in regards to the Eastern churches, but the Alexandria document admits many of these critiques that the East has had for so many years.
Yeah, well, I know the document points out many of the erroneous documents that were forgeries, but what I think that it's not just the whole idea of temporal power that I think is where we're disagreeing. I think it's like when you say stuff that like this is not the job of the papacy. You said that earlier, and I agree. That's the job of the laity. But I think that the laity, just from a Catholic perspective, I know you disagree with this, but this is just how it's working out in my mind, right? The laity are under the Pope, and the Pope and the bishops have this teaching authority that extends not just to supernatural revelation that we couldn't know on our own, right? But natural revelation, not even the natural moral law. And so as the laity, the Pope does have authority to define matters of morals that will impact how I govern and how I govern my particular state and the laws that I'm going to implement. When the bishop, the USCCB, or the Pope says something specific about some moral issue, it's somewhat definitive. It's not just, a recommendation or something or some off the cuff remark. Then he does have some authority. When they say that abortion is wrong, that has some sort of authority, some sort of play when you have a laity that is in charge. And so, like you said, what the church can do and what the state can do. And what I'm struggling with, Jay, is that what happens when the state is made up of the church. So I want to see the church as not just the Pope, not just the Pope. The church is not just the Pope, and it's not just the bishops, it's the laity as well. And so when you say what the church can do and what the state can do, it's like, well, there are Catholics in the state. And so the Catholics are if you're in a society where you have a Christian society, the Catholics are the state. And so therefore, because the Catholic laity are part of the church and they make up the state, it gets very difficult to kind of make the distinction or division that I feel like you kind of, I don't say you
no, but you see, again, this is already the situation in, say, the centuries of 450 to, say, 900. The majority of the empire is already Christian. We already have a succession now of Byzantine emperors who are at least somewhat Christian and perhaps even possibly saints, if we talk about St. Justinian. And so we already have this model, this situation there. It's not something that we have to figure out retroactively centuries later. It's already there in these centuries, and we have this double-headed eagle model for a reason, because it's exactly the model that you see in the councils, particularly 4, 5, 6, 7, and the way they speak of the relationship between the church and the state. So it's not a mystery. You have that as the normative guiding principle, the double-headed eagle model, and then we get a radical alteration in the 11th, 12th, 13th century in the West, where they go a different pathway. So the difference between what you just laid out, which a lot of it sounds good, and you're saying, yeah, but the Pope is just kind of speaking to Catholic laity, so by necessity, there's going to kind of be, Catholic wars and Catholic rulers. No, that's not what's in question with Dictatus Papae and Unam Sanctam. This is the Pope now going beyond that and saying, because of the donation of Constantine and the Sammachian forgeries, I now am the Emperor of Emperors. That's different than saying that the church can speak to the state and tell them that they're wrong about, gay marriage or whatever. This is the Pope saying, I am the Emperor of Emperors. I'm not just the head of the church. I am the Emperor of Emperors. You don't see that that's like vastly different than the model of bishops or even the papacy earlier in the 6th, 7th century speaking to and telling emperors that they're heretics and that they're excommunicated. It's a step further to say that I am also the King of Kings and Emperor of Emperors, and I can call armies and do what I list.
Well, I think because Jesus has that authority and he exercises it through the papacy. He exercises that teaching authority. Again, how does Jesus, I think the question comes down to the relationship between the clergy and the laity. And this is why I asked you earlier, what kind of authority does Patriarch Bartholomew or any other patriarch have over, and I know they're not little popes, but they do have an authority over the laity, the Orthodox laity that are in their region, that are rulers.
Yeah, they can excommunicate. They have a spiritual power, but that does not mean that. Look, here's the false. Here's the analogy. Yeah, here's where the analogy would break down. It would be like Kirill saying, "I am also the emperor of Russia." That's the breakdown of the analogy. So we agree that the church can tell the state things, and they have a power to excommunicate a king or a president or a ruler or whatever. But the difference is that Kirill can't come in and say, "I am the emperor of all Russia." It's that simple.
Yeah, I don't think the Pope is I think it just depends on it depends on
Have you read Unam Sanctam? The wording of Unam Sanctam?
Yes, I have. I haven't read it in a while. I mean, we could go through it if you want.
Right. Well, it says, and particularly at the end, if you do not accept, and remember the context was the Pope being imprisoned and this kind of stuff at the time. And the statement at the end is that if you do not accept that the terrestrial power is underneath the Petrine and spiritual power, to the extent that the Pope is also a temporal ruler, you are excommunicated. And my challenge is that this is never taught.
Can we read this together?
Well, it's kind of long. I don't mind reading it, but perhaps
not the whole thing. Not the whole thing. But if you have the specific line.
It's the last, let's see. According to Blessed Dionysius, the law of the divinity is that the lowest things reach the highest places by intermediaries. Then, according to the order of the universe, all things are not led back to the order equally and immediately, but the lowest by the intermediary and the inferior by the superior. Hence, we must recognize more clearly that the spiritual power possesses in dignity and nobility any temporal power whatever. So notice the argument is that because the spiritual is above the temporal, therefore the spiritual has any temporal power whatsoever, since spiritual things surpass the temporal. This we see very clearly also by the payment, benediction, and consecration of the tithes, but the acceptance of power itself by the government even of things. For with truth as our witness, it belongs to the spiritual power to establish the earthly power and to pass judgment on it if it has not been good. Thus is accomplished by the prophecy of Jeremiah concerning the church and the church power. Behold, today I have placed you over kingdoms, nations, and kingdoms, and the rest. So notice the prophecy of the church and the prediction of Christ there is applied now to the Pope, the Jeremiah passage, as if that's telling the Pope that he has the ability to be a geopolitical world power and emperor, right? I would argue that's totally out of context. Not at all what? No, it is not arguing that. It is arguing that Jeremiah is telling the church and predicting the church to have temporal power. Thus, but that's not what that Jeremiah passage is about, and it's not saying that the Pope can be a global world emperor. None of these passages say that. That's the false conclusion. Now, I'll finish this just a little bit more. Therefore, if the
talking about Jesus.
No, it's talking about the papacy having these powers. That's where it goes next.
No, Jeremiah is talking. Behold, today I've placed you over nations and over kingdoms. That's fulfilled in Jesus.
I know that, but the argument of this passage is that therefore it is also in the papacy. That's the whole argument of this encyclical or dogmatic statement.
Yeah, because
well, yeah, okay. So that was my point. Now let me finish. There's a little bit more. Therefore, if the terrestrial power errs, it will be judged by the spiritual power. If a minor spiritual power err, it will be judged by the superior spiritual power. If the highest power of all errs, the Pope, it can only be judged by God and not by man, according to the testimony of the apostle. The spiritual man judges all things, although he himself is judged by no man, 1 Corinthians 2:15. This authority, however, though it has been given to man and is exercised by man, is not human, but it is divine, and it is granted to Peter by a divine word reaffirmed to him, Peter, and his successors, by whom Jesus said, whatever you bind on earth, it will be bound in heaven, Matthew 16:19. Therefore, whoever resists this power, which is ordained by God, resists the power and ordinance of God, Romans 13:2. Even though Romans 13 is about the temporal state power, the papacy is here saying that the papacy has that state power. Unless he invent, like Manichaeus, two eternal beginnings, which is a false and heretical thing judged by us, since according to the testimony of Moses, it is not the beginnings, but in the beginning that God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1. Therefore, we declare and we proclaim and we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. That means you have to accept this document's teaching of temporal supremacy to be saved.
Yeah. But here's if you read it slowly again, you can see that what he's drawing on is the analogy between the soul and the body and the soul, which is exactly what
well, I don't grant any of that has anything to do with the papacy being a world emperor. Because the body-soul analogy is used by other church fathers to talk about the relationship of church to state. Not that the church is the state. And that's precisely But
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I interrupted you. Sorry.
That's precisely where this document and others in the medieval Franco-Latin papal tradition are taking this line of argumentation. They're saying that because the church is above the state, it therefore is also and can be the state. That's the problem.
Okay. So it would be like saying, look, what you're saying is that the intellect and the will govern the lower passions. And what the Pope is saying is that the intellect and the will are the passions. But the intellect and the will can't be the passions because for the first several hundred years of church history, we've always understood that the intellect and the will are distinct from the passions or are separate from the passions. And I think what the Pope is saying here is that the spiritual power, the soul, the intellect and the will rule and govern the passions, the lower the body itself.
No, that is not all that's being said. He is saying that he is saying that because the church is above the state, it is also a state. That is what he's saying. And that's why the papacy becomes a state and eventually has a giant Vatican bank and an intelligence network and spies and assassins and warrior monks and all the standing armies, all the things that states have.
Well, I think the church is the state. It's the laity. And I think the spiritual power...
No, the church is not the state in Chalcedon, and that's why there's a distinction between clergy and you can't be in the state. So you're doing the very thing that is the problem, saying that the church is a state. It is not a state.
So you're saying that Chalcedon Canon 7 is saying that the church has no business in the state because of clergy, which are one...
The church members cannot take on roles of the state, and to call standing armies and to be the emperor of emperors is to be a state. The papacy becomes the papal states.
You said church members cannot be part of the state, and what I want to say is that
clergy cannot be the state. Church members absolutely should be in the state. The state has a duty to God and to the church. That does not make the church the state.
Well, it doesn't make the church equated with the state, but it means that there are people that are part of the church, the laity.
But these documents make the church the state. It makes the Vatican a geopolitical world state, which it is still.
Yeah, I don't think... Yeah, I'm just going to keep repeating what I'm saying, so I don't know how we gain ground here. I think that the body soul analogy that the popes are drawing on in Unam Sanctam and Immortale Dei and other places is kind of what I would just rest.
But the body, right? So the body being subject to the soul, right, having those lower passions, right, does not make the soul a body. That's the point I'm trying to make. They're distinct.
Yeah.
They have a relationship. They have a synergized, interconnected. They should be working and speaking together. And certainly the spiritual is above the temporal, but none of that makes the spiritual the temporal. That's the point. And the papal model does that, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think that, yeah, when you use words that I am the emperor of emperors. You know, it depends on what he means by that. If he means that he is the he is the spiritual power, and in that sense he governs, he is the head over all of the lower passions, the body itself, then that makes sense and that's consistent. If he means that literalistically, that he himself is now taking on, as you said, a secular office.
I think that that's not even in question. I think pretty much any scholar, Uniate, Roman Catholic of this period will admit that that's what happens, particularly post Dictatus Papae into the Renaissance Borgia papacy. That's exactly what happens.
Well, I mean, this is challenging for me. So what I'll do is I'll have to go back and I'll message you for some more resources. I'll look at these specific cases that you're talking about. Again, like I said in the beginning of my video, what you're bringing up is not something Catholics should shy away from and say, this is Jay trolling Catholics. This is something Catholics absolutely need to press into and not run from. So what I'll do is what I would say is send me what you have specifically about the kind of claims the papacy is making, right? I'll look more into it, and then either I'll come back on for a stream or I might even do a video, response.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And by the way, I've got your video link, so if people want to see the initial response that Chris gave, it is in the show description. If you guys are interested, be sure and follow him. His channel is linked as Christopher Plance in the show description there. Specifically, I would say that a couple books that I think really treat this issue very well would be not the whole book, but maybe the first 100 pages of Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy by Meyendorff and Papadakis, and then Papacy and Orthodox by Soshinsky. Really just the first half of this book, so you wouldn't have to read this entire thing. Just the first, 190 pages would be good. So those are probably two of the best that I could think of right away. Like I said, there's others that would be good too. Dvornik's Phocian Schism book is good. I don't.
Okay, I'm gonna get these books per your recommendation.
Sure. Okay. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you want evidence that from doctrinal, dogmatic evidence, or are you looking for evidence from the church fathers in general? Like, sort of, are you saying, Chris, give me one church father, or are you saying, give me something from a council, or what?
Anything. I mean, if there's any evidence that isn't, and I'm not trying to be crude or rude, that it's not a forgery. Maybe there is something out there. I don't know. I'm not aware of it, but I've not seen anything on this specific issue that addresses this in the first 8 centuries about temporal supremacy. Now, maybe because the Papal States arises within this time frame, there may be popes who have said something like, we do have this authority. But again, as far as I'm aware, when that does come up, it's usually referencing, things that are forgeries. So if there's something that's a non-forgery evidence, I would be very interested in that. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, I'll keep doing research and I'll see what I can find and reach out to you. But thanks for challenging me on this, and especially bringing up these important documents that I think that Catholics need to take seriously.
Absolutely, yeah. And we didn't get into a lot of the the specifics of like Dignitatis Humanae, but to be a little more precise on that topic, which you did allude to many of those documents, I would argue that Syllabus of Errors, Immortal Dei, a lot of those Vatican I era documents that are condemning liberalism. I think even Pacendi touches on this a little bit. I think those also spill over into this question of, Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae, and even the decree on on ecumenism and other things. I think they go really far in the other direction of religious liberty that, in my view, does contradict the things that are said in those papal documents around the time of Vatican I. Now, maybe you would disagree, but maybe next time we can get into more of the Vatican II type stuff if you want to come back.
Yeah, no, totally. I've really enjoyed this, and thanks so much for having me on. And I would love to come back. I mean, you've been such a great host. And like I said, I love that you challenge us on this, and I need to look more into the stuff that you were saying, and I'll try to get back to you. I think it's important enough to spend time looking into it. So I'll get those 2 books, and then I'll message you some more stuff, and you can,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.